Every single day, somebody in a relationship right now is doing everything right, loving hard, staying loyal, showing up, and they're still going to get cheated on. That's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud, so let me be the one to say it. You cannot control what another human being decides to do behind your back. You cannot love someone so hard that it becomes impossible for them not to betray you. That's just not how it works. But here's what I also know to be true. There are certain habits, certain way of moving through a relationship that drastically reduces the chances of infidelity ever touching your life. I'm talking about habits that make you so valuable, so grounded, so impossible to overlook that the thought of losing you, becomes the scariest thing your partner can imagine. These are the 7 habits of men who rarely get cheated on. And I need to be very clear before we go any further. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that if you follow these 7 things, you're bulletproof. Nobody's bulletproof. We live in a world where people make selfish decisions every single day, regardless of how good their partner is. So by no means does this, having these habits mean that you will never get cheated on. That's just not realistic. But what I am telling you is this: the men who consistently practice these 7 habits, well, they stack the odds so heavily in their favor that betrayal, it becomes the exception, not the pattern. Now, make sure you watch to the end because habit number 7 is the one that I personally believe every man needs to hear. So make sure you watch this all the way through because the last one, well, it might change your entire perspective on what it means to be a man in a relationship. Let's get into it. Habit number 1, they set standards before they set a title. Most men enter a relationship and figure out their boundaries, after something goes wrong. She stayed out until, after 3 a.m. without calling. And suddenly now you have a boundary about communication. She's texting her ex and now you have a rule about that. But by then, you're negotiating from a place of pain instead of a place of power. The men who rarely get cheating on, they do it backwards. They know exactly what they will and will not tolerate before the relationship even begins. Not because they're insecure, but because they've done the internal work to understand what they require from a partner in order to give it their best. Habit number 2, they stay emotionally present. This is the one that trips up so many good men. You think because, you're in the house, because you come home every night, because you pay the bills and you're loyal, that should be enough. You see, a woman can feel completely alone in a relationship with a man who is always around. Presence is not proximity. Presence is attention. It's noticing when her energy shifts. It's asking how she's doing and actually listening to the answer. It's putting the phone face down at dinner and looking her in the eyes like she's the most important thing in the room because in that moment, she should be. The men who rarely get cheating on are not just there. They are tuned in. They notice the little things before the little things become big problems. Emotional distance. What's the number 1 open door for someone else to walk through? And most men don't even realize they left it wide open. You want to know how most affairs start? They don't start with attraction. They start with attention. Some other men noticed what you stopped noticing. He asked the questions you stopped asking. He made her feel heard while you made her feel invisible. That's not a competition you lost because the other guy was, better looking or more successful. That's a competition that you lost because you stopped showing up emotionally and somebody else stepped into the space that you left empty. Habit number 3, they never stop dating their partner. I see this all the time. A man will move mountains to win a woman over. He's planning dates. He's sending good morning texts that would make a poet jealous. He's creative, attentive, fully locked in. And then they get in a relationship and suddenly all of that just stops. Like he got the job and decided that, he doesn't need to perform anymore. And the woman is sitting there like, wait, where did that guy go? The guy who made her feel like the only woman on the planet. Now you got her competing with a PlayStation for your attention. The men who rarely get cheated on understand something critical. The pursuit, it doesn't end when the relationship begins. It deepens. You're not chasing her anymore, but you are choosing her. Every single day, you wake up next to that person is another opportunity to remind them why they chose you back. Complacency has killed more relationships than cheating ever has. And understand that it doesn't take grand gestures. It just takes consistency. A random text in the middle of the day that says, I was just thinking about you. A date night that isn't just Netflix on the couch again. Looking at her the way you did the first time, she took your breath away, even though it's been 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, or even over a decade. The effort is the romance. The consistency is the passion. Men, stay sharp, stay intentional, and never let her wonder if you still care. Make it obvious. Now, before I hit you with habit number 4, I need you to do something real quick. If you're watching this and you're like, yeah, I needed to hear this today, then go follow me on Instagram right now. I post daily reels and stories over there that never make it here on YouTube. I post raw, real, in-the-moment advice about relationship, about becoming a better person, about building a life worth, being proud of. I'm going to go ahead and leave the link down in the description below and in the pinned comments. So give me a follow, and I promise you that your feed is about to get a whole lot wiser. But right now, let's keep going, because this next one, it separates the boys from the men. Habit number 4, they walk away from disrespect without giving a speech about it. A lot of men think that standing up for themselves means arguing louder, getting the last word, making their point until the other person finally, gets it. But the men who command the most respect in the relationship, they don't argue. They don't beg anyone to treat them right. They just move quietly, decisively, without drama. They create a distance that speaks volume, because it says, I love you, but I love myself enough to not stand here and let you disrespect me. Proverbs 29:11, it says it best. A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Habit number 5, they guard their circle. Show me your 5 closest friends and I'll show you your future. If your inner circle is made up of men who cheat on their wives, who talk about women like they're disposable, who treat loyalty like a suggestion instead of a standard, then it's only a matter of time before that energy seeps into your relationship. The man who rarely get cheated on, they pay attention to the ecosystem around their relationship. They're careful about who they spend time with. They're cautious about environments that invite temptations, and they hold themselves accountable even when nobody is watching. Loyalty, it's not a solo act. It's a culture. You have to build it in your friendships, in your habits, in the spaces that you occupy, because if the people around you don't respect commitment, well, then sooner or later, that disrespect, it will find its way into your doorstep. Gentlemen, listen to me. Guard your circle. Audit it regularly. Understand that proximity is influence, whether you realize it or not. Habit number 6, they communicate the hard stuff before it becomes a crisis. This right here is the habit that would have saved about 70% of relationship if men actually practiced it. Most of us were raised to bottle everything up. Don't cry, don't complain, be a man, handle it on your own. And we carry that into our relationship, thinking that silence equals strength. But silence in a relationship, it's not strength. Silence is a ticking time bomb. The men who rarely get cheated on bring things up in real time. When something bothers them, they say it. When they feel disconnected, they name it. When they notice that their partner, pulling away, they don't pretend that everything is fine and hope it fixes itself. They sit down and have the conversation that nobody wants to have before it becomes the argument that nobody can come back from. You know what most relationships actually die from? It's not one massive betrayal. It's 200 small conversations that never happened. It's 200 moments where someone thought about saying something and decided that it wasn't worth the fight. And all of those unspoken words, they pile up until the distance between the two becomes so wide that the third person can just walk right through the gap. So men, don't be afraid to talk to your partner. Say the hard things, say them with love, say them with respect, but for the love of God, just say them. And habit number 7, they fear God more than they fear losing her. Now, I know that sounds intense, but stay with me, because this is the foundation underneath everything that I just said. You can set standards, you can stay present, you can communicate, you can guard your circle. But if your identity is not rooted in your relationship with God first, then all of that, it will eventually crumble. Because the moment life gets hard, the moment temptation shows up, the moment that your relationship hits a season that, makes you question everything, you need something to stand on that is bigger than your feelings. The men who are nearly impossible to cheat on are not the ones who love their girlfriend or wives the most. They're the men who love God the most. And I need you to really sit on that because our culture has, completely backwards. We tell men that their woman should be their world, that she should be, the center of everything. But when you make a human being the center of your universe, you're putting the weight of your identity on something that was never designed to carry it. Only God can carry that. So when God is your first love, everything else falls into its proper place. You love your woman better because you're not asking her to fill a void that only God can fill. So put God first, not tied for first, but first. Love him more than you love her, and I promise you, you will love her better than any man who doesn't put God first ever could. So let me wrap this up. 7 habits. Set your standards before, the relationship starts. Stay emotionally present and not just physically around. Never stop pursuing the person that you already have. Walk away from disrespect. Guard the circle around your relationship. Communicate the hard things before they become the breaking things. And above all, root yourself in faith and purpose so deep that nothing and no one can pull you guys out of alignment. Now remember, these habits, they won't make you invincible. Nothing will. But they will make you the kind of man that people fight to keep, not the kind that they take for granted. And at the end of the day, that is all any of us can control. Not what someone else chooses to do, but who we choose to become. If you got any value out of this video, share it with one man in your life who needs to hear it tonight. One friend, one brother, one cousin who's going through it. Send them this video because sometimes the truth that you need the most comes from a conversation you didn't even know you were supposed to have. Thanks for watching. Oh, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.